When Princess Anne, known for her stoic composure, stormed out of Buckingham Palace in full view of staff and security, gasps echoed through the halls. But what could push the most loyal royal to break protocol? Whispers of a public humiliation involving Camilla and Catherine suggest this wasn't a moment of weakness, it was the explosion of a long-suppressed fury. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began like any other afternoon in the palace, quiet, calculated, rehearsed. But suddenly, the rhythm of royalty was shattered. Doors slammed. Anne's sharp heels echoed like war drums down the marble corridors. Guards stood paralyzed. Her face, typically unreadable, carried a fire that hadn't been seen since the early days of her public defiance as a young princess. Staff exchanged stunned glances. One whispered that Anne had delivered a final chilling sentence before turning her back. "This family has lost its honor." The shock was immediate, not because Anne had finally cracked, but because she had chosen to do so in front of an audience that would leak every detail. What ignited this royal rupture wasn't a private betrayal, but rather a moment that unfolded just 24 hours prior at a high-profile charity gala. It was there, under the blinding lights and between champagne toasts, that Camilla's remark fell like a poisoned arrow cloaked in silk. A throwaway line to some, but to the initiated, it was a calculated strike. "Some people forget they weren't born to this life," Camilla had murmured, her gaze fixed coldly on Catherine across the ballroom. The air changed. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the orchestra hesitated before finding their notes again. Catherine smiled politely, but her eyes betrayed the sting. "And Anne?" Anne's jaw tightened. Her silence was not compliance. It was the beginning of her reckoning. Few outside the royal circles know the depth of Anne's regard for Catherine. It is not a bond forged of titles, but of earned respect. For years, Anne had watched Catherine withstand storms that would have broken others. She admired her discipline, her humility, and her unflinching sense of duty. She had taken Catherine under her wing in quiet ways, offering advice, shielding her from unseen daggers, guiding her through the maze of royal obligation. So when Camilla humiliated Catherine in public, it wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it was a betrayal of Anne's silent guardianship. And Anne never forgets a betrayal. In private, sources say Anne confronted Camilla after the gala, behind closed doors. It was said to be brief, only a few words exchanged, but loaded with decades of frustration. Camilla, dismissive as ever, offered no apology. And that, for Anne, was the final nail. The very next morning, she arrived at Buckingham for a scheduled meeting. But as soon as she entered the room and saw Camilla seated beside King Charles, as though nothing had transpired, Anne snapped. She stood only long enough to say she would not participate in a monarchy that humiliated its most loyal. And with that, she walked out. No goodbye, no bow, just silence, followed by thunder. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst, it was a long-coming reckoning. For years, Anne had abided by the unspoken rule, never let the world see division. But something in her broke that day. Maybe it was Catherine's quiet dignity. Maybe it was Diana's ghost still whispering in the background. Maybe it was the realization that silence now would be complicity. Whatever it was, Anne had reached her limit, and the palace would never be the same again. But to understand why this explosive confrontation truly shook the palace, we must rewind to the event that triggered it all, a royal gala that would go terribly, irreversibly wrong. The gala was meant to be a display of unity, but it ended in fractured loyalties and silent wars. Camilla's comment, seemingly innocent to the untrained ear, landed like a dagger in royal circles. But why was it aimed at Catherine? And why did Anne take it as a declaration of war? It was a night crafted with care, opulence, tradition, and diplomacy woven into one elegant affair. Hosted at a centuries-old royal venue, the charity gala drew nobles, dignitaries, and the most senior members of the royal family. Cameras flashed, glasses clinked, and rehearsed smiles dominated the room. But behind every calculated gesture simmered unseen tensions. Among them, one seated dynamic drew noticeable attention: Camilla, radiant in her role as queen consort, perched firmly beside King Charles, while Catherine, the Princess of Wales, arrived later and was seated apart from the central circle. It didn't go unnoticed. nor did the air of subtle exclusion that followed. Then, it happened. During a brief lull in the program, a cluster of senior royals gathered for light conversation: Camilla, Charles, Anne, William, and Catherine. As laughter rose over a passing anecdote, Camilla leaned slightly forward, lifted her glass, and said in a tone dripping with irony, "It's rather amusing, isn't it? Commoners playing queens." The words floated through the space like smoke from a lit fuse. For a moment, silence consumed the group. No one responded, but reactions said everything. William's smile vanished. His hand gripped the base of his glass tighter. Anne's head tilted ever so slightly, her eyes narrowing with something between disbelief and disgust. Catherine, always the master of composure, simply looked ahead, but the pain was unmistakable. A subtle flinch, a tight blink, and then that same poised smile, the armor she had learned to wear long ago. Guests nearby noticed the sudden change in mood. Conversations faltered, aides exchanged glances, and in that chilling moment, Anne took a step closer to Camilla and, in a tone too low for the cameras to pick up, but sharp enough to cut glass, whispered something that would become the stuff of palace legend. A few words, no raised voice, no visible outburst, just the chilling intensity of a woman who had finally had enough. Then she turned, her back straight, and walked away. No one followed. No one dared. Insiders later claimed that Camilla dismissed the moment as a joke, just harmless banter. But to those who understood the depth of royal dynamics, it was no joke. It was a coded attack, a power move, an insult wrapped in silk. For years, Camilla had fought for legitimacy, clawing her way into public acceptance after decades of scandal. But Catherine, she had earned her place with quiet dignity and relentless loyalty, and Anne knew it. That night, the Queen's only daughter saw something she could no longer stomach: an old game being played on a new target. And she wasn't about to let it slide. For William, the moment solidified something deeper. That protective instinct he reserved for his wife surged. He didn't react publicly, but his eyes never left Camilla for the rest of the evening. And Catherine, though outwardly composed, radiated an ache that only Anne seemed to notice and refused to ignore. But Camilla's words weren't just a spontaneous jab. They were the culmination of a long, simmering power struggle, one Anne had warned about for years. While the world focused on Diana's legacy and Camilla's rise, a quieter alliance was forming behind the scenes between the crown's unbreakable daughter and the woman chosen to shape its future. Few knew how deeply Anne had come to respect, even love, Catherine as both a royal and a woman. It didn't begin the grand gestures or headline-worthy events. It started with a glance, a shared nod, and a mutual understanding of what it meant to be under the relentless weight of expectation. Anne, hardened by decades of royal pressure and personal sacrifice, had always kept a distance from the newcomers. But Catherine was different. There was no pretense in her, no hunger for the spotlight. She moved with grace, not calculation, and that caught Anne's attention. The early days were filled with quiet solidarity, an encouraging word after an exhausting engagement, a reassuring smile during moments of intense public scrutiny, and the occasional hand on the shoulder when headlines grew cruel. As the world dissected Catherine's every move, Anne became an unseen pillar of support. Behind closed doors, the bond grew. While others underestimated Catherine, Anne saw something else: fortitude, a kind of endurance that didn't need to shout. She invited Catherine to private lunches. They rode together to lesser-known engagements. Conversations flowed not about fashion or flattery, but about duty, sacrifice, and survival. When Catherine was slammed by the press over her family, her past, or her perceived passivity, it was Anne who fiercely reminded senior staff that loyalty was earned, and Catherine had earned hers 10 times over. Few knew that it was Anne who personally intervened when Catherine faced her first major scandal, insisting the palace protect her with the same fervour it would any blood royal. Anne began to see in Catherine the qualities that once defined the late Queen: unwavering discipline, the ability to remain calm under attack, and a quiet strength that didn't need applause to feel valid. It wasn't about titles or power, it was about consistency. integrity. Where others saw a future consort, Anne saw an emerging matriarch, someone who, despite being born outside the aristocracy, carried the monarchy on her shoulders without complaint. And when Camilla, in one calculated moment, tried to cut that legacy down with a single remark, Anne's blood boiled. Because this wasn't just about a comment, it was about years of silent struggle being mocked by someone who had once been the very cause of another woman's destruction. To Anne, Camilla's words weren't a slip of the tongue, they were a provocation, a line crossed, a deeply personal betrayal of someone she had chosen to shield. And for a woman like Anne, who rarely formed emotional attachments, who chose her allegiances with brutal caution, this cut wasn't just deep, it was unforgivable. The insult to Catherine echoed far beyond the gala. It was a blow to Anne's own judgment, a questioning of her loyalty, and a stark reminder that some forces within the palace still sought to diminish the very future they pretended to protect. But to understand Anne's fury, we must uncover the dangerous undercurrents that have long divided the senior royal women, especially Camilla's secret insecurities about Catherine's influence. Despite her queen consort title, Camilla's crown sits uneasily haunted by the shadow of Diana and threatened by the effortless admiration Catherine commands. In private, palace aides whisper of Camilla's growing paranoia and her increasing need to reassert dominance. For all her years beside Charles, Camilla has never truly escaped the legacy of the woman who once stood where she does now. Diana's ghost haunts every corridor she walks, every public appearance she attends, every photograph where smiles are forced and comparisons are inevitable. And then there's Catherine, poised, beloved, and effortlessly regal. Where Camilla once fought for acceptance, Catherine was embraced almost instantly. Her grace didn't have to be sold to the public, it was felt. And that was the wound Camilla never admitted aloud. It wasn't just that Catherine was popular, it was that she didn't have to fight for it. She earned it by being everything the public hoped a future queen would be. That, in Camilla's eyes, made her dangerous. Within the palace walls, murmurs of a new era began circling. Staff and insiders, those who observed without speaking, began referring to Catherine as the people's future queen. Worse, some whispered she was Diana reincarnated in duty and demeanor, minus the chaos. To Camilla, that wasn't flattery, it was a threat. She remembered how Diana had once eclipsed Charles, how her mere presence commanded attention that no title could demand. Now, she watched it happen again. Only his time, with Catherine, and this time, under her roof. It wasn't just about jealousy, it was survival, because power in the royal household isn't measured by crowns, it's measured by influence, and Catherine had plenty. Behind closed doors, Camilla began asserting herself in quiet but cutting ways. Sources claim she often intercepted, proposed initiatives from Catherine's office, downplaying their importance, questioning their timing, or flat out shelving them under the guise of protocol. There were whispers that Catherine's mental health awareness campaign had been delayed due to Camilla's insistence on prioritizing her own domestic abuse initiative. Officially, it was framed as logistics, but insiders say it was a message Catherine would not rise unchallenged. Even their schedules, once neatly coordinated, began to clash in subtle battles for press attention. And when Catherine's engagements inevitably garnered more headlines, Camilla's frustration deepened into something far more personal. Her growing unease bled into her relationship with the grandchildren as well. Charles adored George, Charlotte, and Louis, his bond with them growing stronger with each passing year. But Camilla, once neutral, began feeling edged out. She wasn't the fun grandmother figure, she wasn't the one they ran to. That was Catherine's space, untouched and untouchable. It fed into a narrative Camilla couldn't ignore. No matter how high she climbed, she would always be in someone's shadow. And so, at that infamous gala, the carefully hidden bitterness surfaced. The comment, "commoners playing queens," was not a mistake. It was a culmination, a flash of all the insecurity, all the resentment, all the fear that had been quietly building behind Camilla's polished exterior. A single sentence that revealed the unraveling mind behind the crown. She wanted Catherine diminished. She wanted the world reminded that not all admiration equals worthiness. But in doing so, she exposed more than her own jealousy. She awoke a defender far fiercer than she anticipated. But Camilla's insult didn't just strike Catherine, it lit a fire under Princess Anne, awakening ghosts of betrayal that she thought she had buried decades ago. For Anne, this wasn't just about Catherine. It was about history repeating itself. The mocking, the exclusion, the cold rivalry, it echoed a time when another beloved woman was slowly dismantled behind palace walls. Diana's memory still lingers, and Anne remembers it all too well. Years ago, Anne stood in the background as her brother's first marriage descended into scandal and heartbreak. She saw Diana, radiant and vulnerable, slowly consumed by the relentless press, internal sabotage, and emotional neglect. But Anne said nothing, not publicly, not even privately, in any way that would have mattered. At the time, she told herself it wasn't her place. She was raised on duty, not drama, on silence, not sentiment. But that silence haunted her. In the aftermath of Diana's DA, Anne began writing in private journals, pages filled with questions she never dared ask aloud. Why didn't she speak up? Why didn't she protect the woman who had no shield? She buried those regrets, but they never died. They waited. And now, decades later, those same shadows returned, only this time. The target wasn't Diana, it was Catherine. A woman who had done nothing but serve the crown with grace, restraint, and quiet determination. A woman who, like Diana, married into a world that smiled in public and clawed in private. Anne watched with growing alarm as the whispers began, small critiques of Catherine's family, her common background, her refusal to break under pressure. Then came the calculated exclusions, the clipped remarks, the icy smiles masked as protocol. Anne had seen this script before, and she knew exactly where it led. Camilla's comment at the gala wasn't merely unkind, it was a mirror, a reflection of all the toxic games that had destroyed Diana. And this time, Anne refused to let the cycle repeat. She saw Catherine standing in the same storm Diana once did, but this time, she wasn't going to let the wind take her. Anne had made a silent vow to herself after Diana's funeral, a vow to never again be the passive witness. And when she heard Camilla's words, that vow erupted to the surface like a volcano long overdue. Because to Anne, this wasn't just about respect. It was about redemption, a chance to confront the sins of the past through the protection of the present. What made it worse was the undeniable truth that Camilla had played a pivotal role in Diana's suffering. It wasn't just speculation, it was history. And now, the same woman who once stood as a symbol of disruption had placed herself on the throne and dared to mock the very type of woman Diana once was. It was as if the palace had come full circle, with old wounds ripping open beneath new crowns. Anne couldn't abide by that, not again. Her loyalty to the monarchy was unshakable, but her loyalty to justice now burned brighter. She knew that in protecting Catherine, she wasn't just standing up for one woman. She was standing up for every woman the crown had failed to shield. The fallout wasn't confined to family whispers. What happened next would ripple across the royal household, forcing King Charles into an impossible position. With one daughter storming out and another publicly insulted, King Charles found himself on a razor's edge. But when the fury of Princess Anne clashed with his loyalty to Camilla, the monarch was left facing a question he could no longer ignore: who truly belongs at the heart of the crown? Inside the palace, the fallout from Anne's exit was immediate. Not just in whispers among aides or subtle shifts in scheduling, but in the very atmosphere. A tension had settled like fog, thick and unspoken. Charles, already burdened by the weight of a modern monarchy crumbling under centuries-old expectations, now faced a private reckoning that struck at the core of his reign. Anne's storming out wasn't simply a family disagreement, it was a statement. And worse, it was public. For a royal known for discretion, such an act meant only one thing: she was done playing nice. The king summoned Anne the following day behind closed doors in a meeting no one was allowed to document. But what leaked was enough. Sources claim Anne made it painfully clear she would not stand by as Camilla mocked Catherine and went unchecked. She reminded Charles, pointedly, that the monarchy was bleeding goodwill, and that Catherine, not Camilla, had become the people's anchor. Either the crown evolves or it erodes. She offered no dramatics, only terms: show respect to Catherine, or watch Anne quietly remove herself from royal duties altogether. A sister's warning, but one laced with devastating consequences. Camilla, meanwhile, doubled down. In private conversations with trusted staff, she dismissed the accusations as overreactions. According to one aide, she laughed off the gala incident as a silly misunderstanding and refused to issue an apology. Her position was simple. She was queen consort, and she would not be corrected or chastised like a junior royal. She expected Charles to stand firm, to protect her from what she framed as emotional manipulation by Anne and William's camp. But the king, trapped between loyalty and legacy, began to falter. Behind the gilded gates, opinion had shifted. Public sentiment was surging in favor of Catherine, and with Anne's visible anger now part of the narrative, headlines turned brutal. Camilla's approval ratings dipped. Online petitions calling for Catherine to be named Queen-in-Waiting exploded. The press painted Anne as the royal truth-teller, Catherine as the victim, and Camilla as the villain in a modern royal drama. Every gesture, every silence, every glance was scrutinized. Charles, once steady in the face of scrutiny, began to retreat. He cancelled 2 engagements. Aides noted his increasing seclusion. One insider claimed he no longer took Camilla's calls past sunset. Whether true or not, the story had taken on a life of its own. The king's dilemma wasn't just about choosing between 2 women, it was about safeguarding the monarchy's future. His crown rested on the illusion of unity, of harmony, but that illusion had been shattered. Anne had walked out. Camilla refused to step back. Catherine remained dignified, but the damage was done. In the silence that followed, Charles was left alone, cornered by consequences he never anticipated. But while Charles hesitated, another force was quietly building behind the palace gates: Prince William, watching, waiting, and preparing to strike. He said nothing at the gala, but his silence wasn't weakness, it was calculation. Prince William, fiercely protective of his wife, had already begun shifting allegiances and leveraging internal influence. What emerged was a plan that would subtly but undeniably push Camilla to the sidelines, in the hours following the gala. While social media dissected every second of the icy exchange between Catherine and Camilla, William was already moving. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't issue statements. But behind palace walls, he became a force no one could ignore. The warmth that once existed between him and Camilla, however fragile, was gone. In its place was an unmistakable frost. During engagements, he avoided her gaze. In meetings, he no longer included her name in future plans. It was a silent punishment, and it cut deeper than any confrontation ever could. Those who had dismissed William as diplomatic to a fault were about to learn he was anything but passive. He began convening quiet meetings with trusted senior aides, not just his own, but those with influence across the royal household. And at the heart of those conversations was one recurring presence: Princess Anne. Their alliance, forged in mutual respect and shared frustration, became a strategic counterbalance to Camilla's growing arrogance. Together, they began reallocating royal responsibilities, reassigning engagements, shifting public appearances, and placing Catherine at the center of the monarchy's forward-facing image. Camilla, once the reluctant face of Charles's reign, was being strategically and systematically edged into the background. Under William's quiet orchestration, Catherine's presence surged. She was now the face of state visits, youth initiatives, and future-forward causes. Royal patronages were restructured, and suddenly Catherine was receiving high-profile roles previously expected to fall to Camilla. The press, already sympathetic to the Princess of Wales, embraced the narrative with vigor. Articles began appearing celebrating the Catherine era. Editorials praised her resilience, her poise, her role as a modern queen-in-waiting, and behind every headline was William, pulling strings with surgical precision. Charles noticed. He was not blind to the shift in power, nor to the growing distance between his wife and son. But when William finally came to him, not in anger, but in clarity, the conversation was brief but seismic. William didn't demand, he stated. This monarchy, he said, would either move forward with dignity or fracture under the weight of ego and outdated allegiances. And then he delivered the sentence that changed everything. You must decide what legacy you want, father yours or the crown's. It wasn't a threat, it was an ultimatum. And Charles, weary and cornered, knew it. But as alliances formed behind the scenes, Camilla wasn't ready to step back. What she did next would only deepen the divide. Determined not to be pushed into the shadows, Camilla launched a charm offensive, but her moves reeked of desperation. And when she tried to reclaim her narrative, the public's reaction was swift, brutal, and unexpected. In the aftermath of William's quiet campaign and Anne's explosive stand, Camilla found herself standing on unsteady ground. The walls of the Publicly, once lined with silent deference, now buzzed with skepticism. Determined not to be made irrelevant, she turned to the one weapon she believed she still controlled: public perception. Her team swung into overdrive, orchestrating a carefully timed release of curated press photos. Images of her laughing with children, visiting charitable organizations, and strolling beside Charles in coordinated outfits flooded the tabloids. But the smiles felt hollow, the timing too obvious. The public, sharper than she expected, saw through the facade. Then came the interview. Intended to humanize her, to present her as misunderstood rather than malicious, it aired during prime time with high hopes. But rather than apologize or even acknowledge the controversy surrounding her comments about Catherine, Camilla chose defiance. She brushed off the gala incident as a bit of misplaced humor, and when pressed on Anne's reaction, she smirked and said, "Some people forget we're not children playing dress-up." The fallout was immediate. Social media erupted. Hashtags like #StandWithAnne and #QueenCatherine now dominated trending charts across platforms. Thousands of comments poured in, calling her out for her tone deafness and perceived arrogance. What was meant to repair her image only confirmed her critics' worst suspicions. Camilla wasn't sorry, and she wasn't backing down. Roy L. commentators, once cautious about taking sides, began shifting their tone. Analysts who had once defended Camilla's Juba Rennie now publicly questioned her judgment. Former allies grew silent. Long-time palace correspondents subtly pivoted, publishing sympathetic pieces about Anne's courage and Catherine's dignity. Even within royal circles, there was a noticeable distancing. Invitations were quietly retracted. Meetings were rescheduled without explanation. And while Catherine and Anne's names appeared more frequently in official statements and public briefings, Camilla's mentions became sparse, strategically buried in footnotes or omitted altogether. Charles, caught in the crossfire, began to visibly unravel. Insiders say he cancelled more than one appearance last minute, citing exhaustion. In public, his face wore the weight of a man torn between roles, husband and monarch. But his indecision only deepened the fracture. A monarch must lead, and Charles, increasingly, seemed pulled by the tides of family politics and public fury. Aides began reporting that he spent more time alone, often taking long walks on palace grounds, seeking counsel not from Camilla, but from his sister and his son. That shift, though subtle, was telling. And Camilla, once the center of Charles's inner circle, now found herself on the outside looking in. The palace she had fought so long to enter now echoed with a cold unfamiliarity. Her presence was no longer strategic, it was seen as a liability. Every step she took to reclaim her influence only exposed how much she had already lost. The more she pushed, the more the institution recoiled. Camilla was no longer shaping the monarchy, she was chasing it. But as Camilla's grip weakens, a final twist emerges, one that could redefine the entire power structure of the monarchy. What began as a moment of rage became a quiet revolution. Princess Anne and Catherine, two women of different eras, now stand united in vision and purpose. As the monarchy shifts, the question remains, is Camilla out for good, or is this just the eye of the storm? It began with a public appearance no one expected. Weeks after Anne's walkout and the royal household's internal upheaval, the Princess Royal and the Princess of Wales emerged side by side at a national remembrance ceremony. The cameras captured everything, two pillars of strength, shoulder to shoulder, walking not just in step, but in unison. There were no speeches, no statements, no dramatics. But the symbolism was undeniable. Anne wasn't just returning, she was aligning. And the public responded with thunderous approval. Polls surged in favour of Catherine's standing. Anne, often regarded as the quiet enforcer of tradition, was now celebrated as the protector of integrity. Together, they represented something long missing from the institution, unity rooted in respect, not hierarchy. Inside the palace, the power structure began to shift. Whispers turned to confirmations as aides leaked the inevitable Camilla was being quietly sidelined. Her name, once woven into the fabric of daily operations, began to vanish from high-level briefings. Major patronages were being redirected. Key events were now anchored by William and Catherine, with Anne taking on senior ceremonial duties long assigned to the monarch himself. A reshuffling of Charles's private council revealed further cracks. Advisors loyal to Camilla were either reassigned or simply vanished from rotation. The new era wasn't being announced, it was being implemented. And Charles, the king who once stood firm beside Camilla, had begun to retreat into silence. Sources revealed that he deliberately removed himself from internal conflicts, delegating sensitive decisions to William. It was a form of passive absolution, an acknowledgement that the institution must survive, even if relationships did not. He began appearing less frequently beside Camilla in public. Their coordinated outings dwindled. The message was subtle, but it was clear Camilla would no longer shape the monarchy's image. That mantle had shifted. Meanwhile, Prince William's role became undeniable. Once hesitant to wield power overtly, he now embraced his influence with quiet precision. His ability to de-escalate behind the scenes, to maintain royal dignity while exacting necessary change, earned him praise from even the staunchest royal critics. He never once addressed the conflict publicly, but his actions echoed louder than any statement. Catherine rose, not by force, but through earned reverence. And Anne, once viewed as the monarchy's stoic soldier, was reborn as its moral compass. In the end, what began with a single moment, an explosive public storm, transformed into something deeper. This wasn't just a royal family in crisis. It was a monarchy on the edge of evolution. And Anne's defiance? It was never a breakdown. It was a reckoning. A declaration that dignity would no longer be silenced and that loyalty would be earned, not demanded. And as the gates of Buckingham Palace close each night, one thing is clear. The monarchy has changed forever, and not everyone will survive what comes next. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.